Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is Dr. Deborah Elizabeth Whaley, who is the author of Black Women in Sequence, Re-inking Comics, Graphic Novels, and Anime. Dr. Whaley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This is an interesting book. It's a scholarly work about the images of black women in comics, and it's also, you get into one of the, earlier black cartoonists who gave us Torchy Brown. I'm sorry, I probably have the name wrong in that. So what inspired you to write this book? I mean, are you a comic fan? And if so, what inspired you to start this project?
I am a comic fan. I'm also an artist. So the idea of the book had been permeating for a while, I would say since at least 2004. And I did read comic books, growing up, as well as comic strips. And I would watch shows like Wonder Woman and even shows like, the television iterations of Batman and Spider-Man. And so always been a fan of comic book characters, whatever iteration it was, television, print, the cinema. And so I had the idea for the book, the idea for the book came about after I saw the film Catwoman, actually. So, even though I had, been reading comic books, drawing comic book characters, I did some training in cartooning, I never thought to do something intellectually on the topic, even though it's something I engaged with as an artist. But around 2004, I had the idea to write the book after seeing the film Catwoman. And I thought, this is really interesting. After the film with Halle Berry, I thought that looking at the character over time, both in the television show Batman, looking at the graphic novel, which I was a fan of, looking at some of the Batman films, that would be a wonderful idea to compare Eartha Kitt's iteration of Catwoman to the Halle Berry iteration of Catwoman. And so it just really started as an article. And then once I started doing research for the article, I found that there really wasn't a lot of intellectual work out there on Black women in comics. And so I thought, this could be a really interesting book project or monograph to write. And then from there, I just continued to do research on characters that I was familiar with and characters that I was not familiar with at all. And the project really just grew from an article to a book.
Now, one of the things that I've noticed, I've done a lot of reading of scholarly works. This is a very readable book, so you don't need to be a student of sociology or of the arts to appreciate this book and enjoy reading it.
Thank you.
Now, I'm assuming you said you started this in 2004. We're right now in 2016. So you were working on this book for 10 or 11 years.
Long time, yes.
And as you were writing and revising and continuing this project, it started to gain some momentum. And what was that moment when you were writing and you thought to yourself, you know what, this has got to be a little bit more, this is something bigger than just the article or the monogram that you were talking about?
Well, I think once I got past doing research on the Catwoman character, which just alone, because there's so many, like I was saying before, iterations of her in different types of media, I began to research characters like Nubia in Wonder Woman, Storm in X-Men, which I was already familiar with, was a fan of the X-Men titles, as well as the X-Men films. And so once I started to look at additional characters, the material was so rich, and I felt like there was so much to say about not only Black women as comic book characters, but the ways in which writers and artists tried to engage with this idea of Blackness and even this idea of Africanness or Africa as it relates to particular characters. And so at that moment, I thought, this is a lot of rich material. There's so much to say, so many wonderful narratives that all of these characters have, and their biographies and the type of cultural work that they do. So at that moment, I thought, this could be much more than an article, and that there was just a lot more to say and to share with readers.
Now, in one of the chapters, you do talk about I guess, the interpretation of a black character by white artists, white writers, and you touch upon one of my favorite characters, Vixen, who I think we're going to be
Yes.
hearing a lot more of as we go further along. I was introduced to her in the very unpopular Justice League Detroit, which is about the time when I got very serious into comics. And then she appeared in Suicide Squad, and now
Yeah.
she'll soon be joining The Flash and Green Arrow on the CW.
Yes.
She's got her own animated series. But the notion that, especially in the 70s, that a black character had to either have black in the title, like Black Lightning or uh, Black Panther, or they
Right.
had to
Yeah.
be a champion of the African people.
Yes.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about?
Popular trope. Yeah. Absolutely.
So can you tell us a little bit about that
It's
trope?
really interesting. And one of the things I sort of think through in the book is so why does this idea of Africa crop up? Why do writers and artists oftentimes portray characters or feel the need to integrate into narratives this idea of Africa? And one of the things that I hypothesize is that this engagement with Africa was a way to present characters with a legible ethnicity. And so I think it was a mixture of a sort of fascination of Africa. And as I talk about in the book, sometimes a fabrication of Africa too, where it was posited as this really sort of mystical way to talk about Blackness and Black characters. And I think it's a topic that really fascinates writers of comics. And so it is something that you see a lot where characters are from Africa in comic books and graphic novels, Vixen included. I have one chapter that specifically looks at the idea of Africa, or what I call the sign of Africa in comic books and graphic novels, whether it's a real sort of Africa and tying it to African religions and language structures, or again, whether it's just something fabricated. You do see it in comics and graphic novels, and it's a very interesting way to approach Black characters that I think is both useful and sometimes erroneous, right? Especially if the representations are so far away from the reality of Africa and Africanness, and it moves from cultural appreciation to cultural stereotype.
Right. And it is interesting because you would see black characters in the comics, especially the characters that are coming out of the blaxploitation period in the 70s. And you had really two types. You had the noble African prince or princess, and you
Right.
had the street person who's going to be using ridiculous phrases like jive turkey or sweet Christmas or something like that. And it seemed like you could never find just a middle class black character in comics at that time. And I don't know if we still are at that point or if we've sort of moved past that.
I definitely think there's more representations out there. So with characters like Vixen, she was a really interesting mix of blaxploitation, but she's also a really powerful character too that moved beyond stereotype. But she certainly had her days of the corny phrases, as you would say. She would say things like, I'll use my 5 knuckles of courage to make you tell the truth or do what I want you to do. But there are some characters that move away from stereotype, that are, like you say, middle class, or not overly stereotyped in language or in the way that they look visually. I mean, I don't think a character, has to be middle class to move away from stereotypes. I think there's some really interesting characters like Martha Washington, who is depicted, Frank Miller's Martha Washington, who her narrative is that she came from a very urban and impoverished area, did well in school, became a freedom fighter. And so I think that's a really interesting example of how you can talk about the complexity of class and blackness in a way that moves away from stereotype. But I think some of the Jackie Orms images that I talk about as well in the book from the 30s and 40s and 50s had some really interesting characters that were middle class, working class, and upper middle class. And in so doing, she was able to represent and grapple with the diversity of blackness and black life and black womanhood. So things are definitely getting better. There's more images and representations out there today, especially as we have more people entering the field who can provide those types of nuanced or more progressive types of images and narratives.
Now, you touched on Jackie Orms, who was the female cartoonist who was working through the 30s, 40s, and I believe the 50s. Now, I had never heard of her, and I have been trying to study comics for most of my life. That lets me avoid real work. So could you tell us a little bit about Jackie?
Absolutely. So Jackie Orms is a Black female cartoonist, and she produced work for the Pittsburgh Courier as well as the Chicago Defender, two Black newspapers. And she did three strips, Torchy Brown, which was a representation of a Black woman who migrates from the South to the North. So it was a migration narrative, the types of things that this character, Torchy, would experience as she dealt with the culture clash between the two regions was the focus of the comic strip. And then she had another comic strip, Candy, which represented a working class domestic. And this was a strip she did in the 1940s. And it was a really wonderful depiction of a domestic or maid that I don't think we had really seen in popular culture. So it moved away from the type of mammy stereotype that we would see in Gone with the Wind, or even a representation that came later than actually Jackie Orms's Candy character, the Beulah character on television. And so it was a great depiction of just the realness, the integrity, the everyday life of a Black domestic. And she did the comic strip with humor and wit and gave voice to a woman in a profession that you just didn't see in popular culture. And she also did a comic strip called Patty Joe and Ginger. Well, I should say they weren't comic strips. The Torchy Brown was a comic strip, but Candy and the third that I just mentioned, Patty Joe and Ginger, were actually gags. They were one panel comic strips. And so the last one was a sort of middle class, upper middle class depiction of a young girl and her sister. And they would talk about civil rights. They would talk about being in sports and being ostracized, because you're a girl who's interested in sports. Lots of discussion about racial and social issues, but some fun issues too about love and romance and everyday types of things that a young girl and her older sister, depicted as a young woman, would experience. So the range of her work was really wide in terms of class and in terms of topics, but all three strips in differing ways dealt with social justice and social issues and the political issues of the times.
And it got her into trouble with the FBI, who investigated her for being a communist because she had, I guess, different ideas than the mainstream American audiences at that time, which, again, looking back at it, just seems somewhat un-American, but I guess times being what they were. Her art was, well, I guess, if I'm looking at a newspaper strip, especially from that time, it was more provocative than let's say, Dagwood and Blondie.
Absolutely. Yeah, both in topic and in illustration too. There are some interesting panels from the Pittsburgh Courier that has depictions, not of nudity, but of sort of slight disrobement that you would not normally see at that time. And so the comic strip was audacious in a number of ways.
And looking at some of the gags, I think the candy strip where she's basically telling her new boss that she's going to give the new boss 2 weeks to try her out.
Right.
So that sort of
Yeah.
turns things on its ear. So it was great to learn about Jackie Orms, who I didn't really know much or anything about. And in reading that, I felt like there's an appreciation for being sort of that voice to try and subtly make changes in society, and yet at the same time still be considered a radical, even though you're doing things in a very clever and not necessarily pushy way. So let's go to the character of the butterfly.
Oh, sure.
What can you tell us about the butterfly?
Well, the butterfly was a character that appeared in Hell Rider, published by Skywald Publications, and similar to the character Vixen in some ways because it came out in the early 1970s. It drew on the Black popular culture and vernacular at the time. It wasn't as blatantly blaxploitation-ish as maybe some of the other comic book characters like Luke Cage, etc. But this is a character who, like her name would suggest, would transform into a butterfly, right? So she was a nightclub singer, and she would fight criminals after she transformed into the butterfly, and she would fly through the air and cast light that blinds, etc. And so she is known as the first Black American superheroine in a comic book, independent comic book. And so she's important in that way for breaking that ground. And again, although in some ways leaning towards some types of stereotypes and the sort of the use of language, was still a very provocative and progressive representation at the time, simply because there was this Black woman in a predominantly white comic book that was depicted as a heroine.
And it's interesting too because that book was independent. It wasn't a Marvel or DC book, and when we look back at that book, we realize that it had probably a more, I don't want to say adult in the way that we think of adult films, but it had certainly a more grown-up tone to it, where the character is, she's a dancer, but then there's narcotics in the heel of her shoe or something like that. And you would never see that in an issue of Spider-Man from the time, which always seemed to be geared more towards children. So, and even going back to Jackie Orms, it seems like the audience is expected to be more sophisticated than the average comic reader. Is that something that you found when you're going through sort of the independent or the, the Black media of the time?
Well, it depends. With the Jackie Orms work, I mentioned some visual representations that were a little bit edgy, but they were still appearing in Black newspapers, so they were by no means anything that would be considered even PG-13, more so PG. I think you see provocative and edgy representations in independent titles. Maybe there's more room, less sort of restrictions that you would see with the major comic book conglomerates. But at the same time, there's lots of titles by Marvel and DC that are just as provocative and that pushes boundaries. And has edgy types of representations. But Skywald was known for more sort of adult graphic novel type of themes in their work, which is one reason why they were so popular. So yes, you had the character Butterfly, who would find herself entangled with drug dealers and all of these sort of adult themes that you wouldn't see in other types of comic books, like the Batman from
Mhm.
DC, or yeah, other sort of mainstream titles. So there's probably more room in some independent titles to push the envelope in ways that some of the mainstream characters and comic book companies may not always be able to do.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Martha Washington, which is a book that I read. I don't want to say religiously because it would sound weird, but I read when it would come out, and I enjoyed the work of Miller and Dave Gibbons, the illustrator.
Yeah.
And in the book, you talk a lot about the subtext, things that, as a casual reader, I never picked up on. So, could you tell us a little bit about what you were seeing in the book and that you kind of mentioned in your book?
Sure. Martha Washington is a really interesting character for many reasons. So we're introduced to her when she's very young, and you do see representations of youth that become superheroes. So that's not necessarily a new trope, but to have a young Black girl who becomes this freedom fighter for justice was definitely not a representation that you saw a lot of in comic books. And some of the things that I talk about in the book, which I mentioned before, is you have this character who lives in an urban area or inner city, however you want to phrase it. But instead of being represented as a victim or in a stereotyped or depraved way, she's a character that has agency. She is a character that is smart. And the writing of Martha Washington, I think, is just wonderful for its ability to talk about and tease out race relations, like we were talking before, not necessarily in a way that's preachy or really obvious, although there are some moments that are very direct about racial and social relations and issues of injustice, but able to do so in a way that's bringing the reader along, that's providing the reader with something to think about, but also providing beautiful illustration and a compelling narrative and characteristics of the character that readers can relate to in a sort of universal way that goes beyond the race of the character.
All right. And it's interesting because that was one of those books that was published by, I believe it was Dark Horse.
Yes.
And it was, so it was sort of a direct sale only book, and I think that was enabling Frank Miller to sort of branch out into some new territory for himself. This was, of course, after his Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One work. We have about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to touch base with a character that Frank Miller actually sort of reinvented in the 1980s, which is Catwoman. You mentioned
Yes.
Eartha Kitt being sort of someone that you saw on television growing up. So the character of Catwoman, you did research on the DC message boards.
Yes.
So as a researcher, how do you go through that and work, I guess, find the real information that you need to help you with your research in what can sometimes be an uncivilized environment?
That's a great question. So when I was talking to readers of the Catwoman title on the message board, this was really before things like cyber ethnography or netnography, I think, had really taken off as a discipline. And now as well as back then, once you begin to talk to people through the means of the internet, you really never know what you're going to find. And so it was a wonderful opportunity to have access to a broad spectrum of readers in a way that I would not normally have without the internet. And so the DC message board was a wonderful vehicle to have conversations. And I learned so much from the readers. Most of the hypotheses or the arguments or the ideas that I came into the project with were dismantled once I talked to actual readers. And so I was really pleasantly surprised by what I would hear from readers. And it was a wonderful process, engaging. And the other wonderful thing about engaging that way is when you're doing a timed one-on-one interview, you sort of come in with your questions and then your interview answers the questions. But on the message board, there was a continual back and forth and engagement, and you could follow up in ways that you cannot in other types of interviewing formats. And you can access international readers and just all different types of people who have access to the internet. And unfortunately, that message board does not exist anymore. But it was a really great space to talk about the character and engage with all the different things that she represents.
Now, you just said that the thread would continue on, so you would pose your question and then you would get the responses. In your research, I'm imagining that when people would respond, it would sort of take the thread in different directions that maybe you didn't think of. And as it continued, and you sort of alluded to that it opened up your mind and changed your preconceived notions. What was the biggest aha moment that you had when you looked at those threads? If there's one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was really interested in the racialization of the character, and I sort of came into the project, especially, I mentioned it started out as an article. And so I came into the project assuming that readers did not respond well to the film iteration of Catwoman as portrayed by Halle Berry because she was Black or African American. But once I engaged with and read the threads and talked to readers, there was a multiplicity of reasons why that film was a failure for fans and for readers, right? So race alone was not an issue, and it was interesting to hear from readers that no matter what their racial, ethnic composition was or gender composition, they too thought that it was important to have Black characters, but it was more so the lack of continuity between the graphic novel and the film that seemed to trouble readers rather than the representation of a Black woman playing the character.
Well,
so that was something that I was pleasantly surprised to read and to learn about.
Well, I'm being told that we've run out of time. This has been a very fast half hour. We've been talking to Dr. Deborah Elizabeth Whaley. Her new book is Black Women in Sequence. I suggest you give it a read. Deborah, thank you so much for joining us on Comic Culture, and thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again next time.